Good morning. It's great to be here. It's great to be invited to this conference. I'm a St. Louisan. I'm going to talk a bit about myself here in a second. But I use the toolbox. I know it's a cliche. Part of the toolbox that we use at Equifax does use data, of course, but it also uses technology and it uses philanthropic resources as well. And I think it's important to understand how the intersection between data and technology and philanthropy is impacting our society and our community. That was my basic introduction. So my background, I'm a St. Louisan. I've been with the company for 13 years, which is probably like 70 years in dog years or millennial years. And it may scream out complacency except for the fact that at Equifax, even though we're in about 22 different countries, my function, a CSR function, has not been global. It's not been connected. So we have different places from Madrid to London to about 6 different Latin American countries where you see initiatives around economic inclusion or financial inclusion or financial capability that were unconnected. And they weren't using data and it wasn't using technology. I'm an adjunct professor here at WashU as well. I hope my co-teacher's in the room, Jenny Harpering. I'm an assistant dean at the Brown School. And I've been teaching here for about 7 years, classes on the creation of CSR strategy and on grant making and on community and economic development. I have 2 sons. Lincoln is 6, Langston is 3. My wife's in St. Louis now too, and she works for Slalom, for anybody from Slalom in the room. It's a game of acronyms from my perspective, and I'm working with WashU students from both Olin and the Brown School and undergraduate on a pretty routine basis. And these things are being redefined on a constant basis. I think the Boston Consulting Group is most guilty of perpetrating new acronyms all the time. So their most recent one is TSI, Total Societal Impact. What are corporations doing by their very nature to change society, to impact society? It's great, right? It makes a ton of sense. But then there's TSR, there's CSR, and there's CSV, and of course Equifax has chosen CSV, and I'll explain that more in a little bit. But CSR is what's typically known as. Historically, it's known as CSR for companies. And what CSR is not doing is changing a whole lot of anything, to be quite honest, as far as I've experienced it. There are usually two tools in the CSR toolbox: philanthropy and volunteerism, right? So either your company gives money away or they send their people forth to do good. And philanthropy in our country in 2017, $410 billion was invested philanthropically speaking. Do you know how much of that comes from corporate America? 30%. But you think it's more, right? Because corporations are throwing their brands out there and they're going race day banners on golf tournaments, on different types of events. So you think that corporate America plays a larger role, and it doesn't. It's sizable, but not what you think. It's coming from individuals and family wealth. So keep that in mind as we continue to work through this presentation. Larry Fink, he dropped that in the New York Times, was it last year? It's quite interesting, right? It caused a lot of people to pay attention because of the prominence of Larry in our society and the investment circles. It's important to consider that, and I think our CEO at Equifax, our new one, Mark Pigor, he's considering this, and a lot of other companies are as well. It's critical, and we need more people like Larry to step up and do this. And where we are at Equifax, obviously you're probably familiar with us for reasons that are not fairly positive in the past year because of the world's largest data breach, speaking of data. But we too, we're at the financial crossroads. We credential lending. We do many things, but that's primarily what a bureau does. And it's critical, right? It's critical to all of your financial lives in this room. So how do we as a bureau, as a fintech, as a DNA company, we are all those things now, how are we benefiting society in a positive fashion? And I don't need to walk through all my slides. I never try to do that. I think this is fairly self-evident, except that we've never, as a company at Equifax, 122 years old, articulated this as our mission. We do now, and it means a whole lot of different things for us in our communities in which we are living and doing work. Shared value. So Michael Porter, many of you probably have read him and know him, out of Harvard in 2011, produced a new framework of thinking about this work, creating shared value. One more acronym, right? But it made a whole lot of sense to me. I was making some tours of Pittsburgh and New York City and some California cities, and I saw people doing this work differently. I was using the same tools that I told you about before. I was sending volunteers out, wonderful people, great skills, and we were trying to solve problems through single grants to single nonprofits that were not scalable. And nowhere in my repertoire of resources was the use of our data or the use of our technology. That's a huge mistake, right? We were not using the basic assets and the very nature of Equifax to drive change in our most vulnerable communities. So creating shared value makes a ton of sense to me, and I also think it's more honest for corporations to simply say, hey, we're going to help you, and we're also going to look at revenue for us as well. It makes a ton of sense. Because if I'm only talking to my senior leadership about philanthropy and charity, they care, but they mostly care on the weekend or after work or after the revenue has been produced. And you're not going to get their attention, and you're not going to keep their attention if you can't show that what you're doing is also driving value for our shareholders, our employees, and our communities. So I've started to think, and it took me a while to get there. I've got a few friends in the audience who work in the NGO sector. And what I've come to understand, if we're going to impact vulnerable communities, is to see them as a market, is to see them as a consumer. And if we do that, then we're going to have at our hands and our disposal a lot more, so many more tools to benefit people's lives positively. And again, this is what we use to describe the work internally. And I would tell you that probably the most important thing, and what I think I see changing in corporate America across the US, is the way in which we all are engaging with the use of data, but talking to residents. Paul Sorensen's in the room, and he's working in an NGO on sort of data schemes and data collection from a community vantage point. And that's critical, because often in rooms like this, there's exciting ideas, but we're a little bit in a vacuum here. You take the work that we're going to hear about today out to North City or to East St. Louis, this is a largely foreign concept. It's not that people can't understand what data means to them, but they're living lives of financial stress in ways that they don't care what the data says it does. They don't care what we're talking about today. They want to see their lives improve. So it's really incumbent on people like us to take what our data is and make it mean something to these communities and individuals who are struggling financially. This is one of my favorite quotes I've heard recently. It's from a young woman who came out of Georgia Tech and is going to work for us in Atlanta. And she's part of a group that I'm an executive sponsor of called the Young Equifax Professionals. It's an affinity group like many large corporations have. And she came up to me and she said this. And I thought that was interesting because, as you might imagine, in the wake of the world's largest breach, our company is focused on preventing a second one. And it's clear and it's well articulated. That is our CEO's mission, is to protect your data. But at the end of the day, that's not enough. And that's not going to make consumers love Equifax and trust our brand in ways that we deserve to be trusted. So I keep that in mind always, because what that says to me is that, again, data is critical. It's critical to the work that all of we're doing. But there's that value side. Michael talked about the human side. It has to be value-driven. If it's not, again, we exist in a data vacuum, in my estimation. So on to a few of the projects that we are using data, technology, and philanthropy to support. One of them is right here at WashU. So the Center for Social Development, which is an applied research think tank out of the Brown School of Social Work, has historically focused on fostering financial capability work across the globe. That's anything from IDA creation to asset building to financial education. Some of your pretty typical areas of focus for underserved communities in terms of financials. They are going to start working with us on some applied research in the consumer-facing area around credit. Our people are tremendously busy, and as you all might imagine, when you're inside of a large company, 11,000 people, things can get clogged down. So outside thinking around data application is critical, and this is what they specialize in. But the cool thing about this is that our teams inside of Equifax, speaking of data and technology, have developed what's called the University Data Environment, and you're going to see more of this in years to come. Currently, it's being piloted in Princeton, in Wharton, in Cornell, and then here at WashU. It's essentially a slice of our overall economic data, and as you know, the bureaus hold a lot of economic data. So this portal allows the researchers here at WashU at the CSD, and then likely the new Involve Policy and Research Center that's being stood up right now, they will have access to our data to start to take a look at what does Centene have, what does Intuit have, what does Equifax have, how does that inform the interventions and the market products that can serve others? That's where we have to be. It's a really cool environment. I'm not a technology person, so I barely understand it. I'm going to show you a slide here in a minute that makes me kind of go blind. But it's a really, really cool tool. So again, a traditional person in my role would say, let's give money to a professor at a prestigious university to do research. And that's fine. But why not give them a tool like this, which others can then have access to and piggyback on, share their research. We, Equifax, become a data hub in the universities across this country, and then push researchers and think tanks like the CSD to share their information, to share the data. It's just a smarter play from us from a community perspective. This is probably my personal favorite and one that I'll be focused on for years to come. About 30 million renters in this country they fall into the category of LMI, low to moderate income. That's 30 million. Rent does not count towards your credit score historically. I mean, you gotta think about that. I'm sure there's many renters in this room. If you're paying a mortgage and you pay it on time, that positively impacts your credit score. If you're a renter and you're a trusted renter, that historically has not. And what we're seeing across the globe is a lot of emphasis on how it becomes something that can boost your credit. Because what's the difference really if you're a trusted payer of your rent versus a trusted payer of your mortgage? Locally, and again, I'm in St. Louis, I'm especially proud of this, we're working with a local nonprofit, Tower Grove CDC, who had a paper product to begin with, a tenant screening process. You have property owners, you have potential renters. They come together, not often in person, but was not a transparent process. And often property owners were making bets on renters who were not stable. And so it creates mobility, which is not a good thing. It destabilizes communities if your renters are constantly moving. It drives down educational outcomes. It drives up poor health outcomes. So this product is now online, automated, digitized, and it's using 3 core aspects of Equifax's products and data. The first, of course, is what we're known for. It does credit pulls. So through Home Screen, this new tenant screening process, a person goes in, or a landlord goes in, they put their property out there for people to see. Renters come online as well. They see what that property is. Then they go through the screen. So that's number 1 is their credit score, right? Number 2 is verification of employment. And for those of you who don't know Equifax, you may not know that in St. Louis is our 2nd largest division in the country. We're headquartered in Atlanta. We have a huge division here in St. Louis. And that division is known for what's called the work number. It's the world's largest employment verification database. So again, a renter goes in, credit score, then verification of employment. All this was being done by hand previously. So we've not only increased the capacity of this nonprofit to drive revenue for themselves and to help people stabilize housing, we're using what's core to Equifax to do this. So this is now in a pilot stage. We're helping them with the technology build. We're piloting the same program in Atlanta, New York, and Boston right now, and believe it's the kind of national model that can, again, be a useful tool for nonprofits that leverages our data, our technology, and certain amounts of philanthropy. This is the slide that makes me kind of go a little bit fuzzy. Again, I'm not a technology guy, but this is where we are. And so we're looking to have more and more conversations. I see some folks in the room from CIC and the Cortex crowd. And what we want to do as a company is something similar to the university data environment, which would be a community data environment. How do we bring together startups and techs and nonprofits who are focused on innovation and the use of data to serve others? We can do that, and these are the types of platforms that we're currently developing to answer those questions. This is an exciting one for me as well, and I probably should have put this slide after the home screen one. Who here has read Evicted by any chance? Awesome. If you haven't, you should run out and get it. It's a tremendous book. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2017. Matthew Desmond is now out of Harvard at Princeton in his eviction lab. And in the book, the primary contention, which was a bit startling, is eviction doesn't lead to poverty, it's a driver of poverty. And evictions as well are tied in large part to a lot of traditional or historic policies that are often racist and problematic and economically exclusionary. Matt is studying this, and so something like our home screen effort becomes very relevant to him. And if you recall, I mentioned the work number. So if we have the largest employment database of those who are employed right now, the records as we call them, it's a predictor of eviction. So again, traditionally, CSR would say, let's support Matt's work with a loaned executive or a DNA person, or even philanthropy to support his research. Instead, if we give him access to the work number database so he can understand that the work number is a predictor of eviction, and we start to help him in his research become applied to prevent eviction, which again drives down mobility, which takes money out of communities, this is a game changer. His book was a game changer. This is potentially a game changer as well. So we're very close to having him inside of our data systems to better get a glimpse of the employment world that he can then take out and do further extrapolations from his research. The final piece is, again, still tied to this rental market, which is a really important market. The comptroller's office in the city of New York is looking at making rent count. They're attaching their efforts to the Parliament out of the UK. Same thing. Everybody is looking at how to make rent count towards credit. So we're a part of that conversation now. We're taking home screen there. We're taking Matt's work there. And we're taking our mortgage division there as well. So we're present for conversations which are, how is data, how is technology ensuring that the most vulnerable renters in our country have a real chance to have stable housing? It's critical. we probably take home, for advantage. We go there every day. It's a great, safe place. For many, it is not. And these people who are going in between rental properties, again, it's not to be dismissive or cavalier about data, but they don't care about data. They care about stable housing. So as I see it, it's incumbent upon us at Equifax to help you a true solution in this space. It's not easy, but our data can help people like Matt, that can help people like the Comptroller's Office in New York City, and those in Parliament in the UK. And that is the end of my presentation. I always kind of go quick, and I try to leave room for questions if you have any. There's a lot of other ways that we're using data and technology that we're still discovering. To be honest, the shift towards creating shared value is only 2.5 years old for me. So trying to implement it in a very old credit bureau is a little bit challenging, especially in this current environment where the company is changing because of what occurred a little bit over a year ago. But what I see and what I learn from my colleagues and counterparts and from my university partners is that there's so much more out there for us in terms of how data is serving people, how technology connects to that, how it's accessible and well articulated, and how it's a valuable tool for all of us besides those in this room. So, any questions? Yes?
So as a university researcher, I'm really excited to see the efforts to open up your data to people who are working on these problems. But how do you do that in a way that doesn't risk any privacy concerns with those people whose data are being shared? And how do you make sure that there's no, even if maybe they can put data together in a way that might somehow down the road end up being
Yep.
a problem for those individuals?
Great. The question is basically, how do you scrub data for the PII or personal information? We do that fairly easily. So when a researcher asks to see some of our data and we have the right environment, and that's just not inherent to it. So Social Security is not a part of it. You can get aggregate down to the cul-de-sac level for a lot of our data, but all of it, of course, is a major concern. Internal to Equifax is a Data Security Council. All requests go in front of it. A key consideration, of course, is what is being put out there, and it cannot be in any way identified on an individual level. But we go through a stringent process for that. It takes a very, very long time. It's a great question. Yes?
You talked about creating shared value, and now you're sharing your data with researchers and other things. How does that create value for Equifax?
Sure. As I see it, and perhaps some of our DNA and our innovative folks might disagree, I think there's real value in taking some work outside of the company. I think you can get so focused on what you're trying to do, and especially now in the wake of the breach, people are just heads down trying to ensure it doesn't happen again and also trying to drive value. So that's just to say, if some researcher at a university can produce thinking on a market tool that we haven't gotten to ourselves, that's the value. So we're in the beginning stage. We're betting on the fact that these researchers will produce thinking that either conflicts with ours, supports ours, or is different than ours. And then from that, we can make interventions and think of products that can be serviceable and drive revenue. So that's the goal. It's still pretty nascent. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
I think this is very, very bold of Equifax. Given what you guys have gone through in terms of fraud and being hacked, what assurances, what PR are you planning should the unthinkable happen again as you're sharing this data with several different universities, creating this partnership? I mean, from a businessman's point of view, or even a consumer's, if this was generally known, it would frighten them and may possibly hurt your brand. I don't know.
No, it's a great question. I couldn't answer to the PR strategy, but I can tell you that the internal process by which data is released into these environments is very, very strict. It's never been more strict. In terms of PR and how we're trying to share this, my goal is always to wait until we've seen real outcomes. We're tremendously careful with people's data. We're so far from outcomes in this work. We're at the activity and input stage with some outputs, as the social work school would term them, that are good and we're proud of, like home screen. That's an output. Outcomes from a CSR or CSV perspective, I think we're years away from. And it's more of a long game. But we're especially considerate and careful around people's personal data, to your point. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So today you guys offer some insight to the end consumer, right, through the credit reporting and the FICO scoring. But that seems to be different. So there seems to be kind of a disconnect between what the consumer sees and what like a lender or someone that's running to something. Are you guys looking to reconcile that so the consumer is aware of what is actually being provided to the lender or a potential renter or
Yeah.
landlord?
That's a great question, and one that I can't personally answer. I'm not privy to those conversations, but I know that they're happening behind different teams and different sales teams, product teams, and then, of course, amongst senior leadership. It's a great question. It's about how consumers are having access and sort of agency over their own data. But yes, it's a primary consideration. Yes, sir. The question is, how do we collect data for this rental world? That is the biggest challenge in this entire space. So across the globe, the challenge in collecting data, it's by single property owner. So we're trying to think of it in terms of scale. It's difficult. We're talking to housing authorities in Boston and New York City, and some in California as well, because you can get a few thousand people into that study. The problem with that, of course, is that there's a tension historically between the housing authority and those who are using that public housing. It's very difficult. None of the bureaus have figured it out, how to pull from all the property owners across the US or globally, but it's a key question that all the bureaus are trying to figure out, because to have that information, both positive and negative being that you don't pay your rent, is going to be very informative for everyone. So that's the challenge. No one's figured it out yet.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I have one question. You just mentioned you can have the confirmation about the employment. I'm just curious, how about the reliability regarding to the ADP data as well? Because from ADP, we definitely know the employment, right? So I don't know what's your source and who is more reliable. Thank you.
That's a great question about the work number and ADP and who's more reliable and where it's being sourced. I'm not in a position to honestly answer that. I have a colleague here today, Lori Gatch, she's in the front row. She can probably give you a much better and more thorough answer. She's part of the Workforce Solutions team. I would encourage you to speak with her during a break. I think she can probably help you with that answer a lot better than I can. But thank you for the question.
Hi, there's over 12,000 nonprofits in town, and most of them are not very technologically savvy.
Yes.
Are you doing any kind of listening or focus groups to find other problems you could solve or help them with? I mean, I think of transportation and food insecurity as two big problems in the area.
Right. No, it's a great question. The question is, are we working with other technology NGOs here in St. Louis? There's quite a few of them. And the answer is yes. The challenge is I'm a team of one. And right now, our technology people are really busy with the cybersecurity remediation the company's undertaking. That being said, yes, we're working with a group in Atlanta called TechBridge. Their entire mission, they're an NGO, is to help nonprofits bridge that capacity gap, right? The majority of nonprofits, to the questioner's point, lack technological savvy to do anything remotely associated with data crunching. So we are. They lack the resources to buy the equipment. They lack the staffing to understand what data looks like. They can survey basically and then hope they can turn it over to usually a WashU, SLU, or UMSL to help them crunch data. But that's a place we want to move to as well. We are a technology company. We have that ability, and we are going to move there. Thanks for the question.
It seems to me in today's world, organizations face less technological challenges. We're awash in data. We have tools. There's new tools popping up all the time. The challenges that organizations face are more cultural. Mm-hmm. How did you marshal the cultural change, or how was Equifax able to do that, to open up this data to other groups, or to be more creative in thinking about what they can do with their data, what they can do with their analytics? Again, it seems to me that cultural change is the biggest problem organizations face as opposed to the technological one.
Great, that's a perfect question. I couldn't agree more. And you might imagine in the wake of the breach, we've seen considerable turnover at Equifax, and we do have a new CEO. So to some degree, you lose some of the institutional memory that led to the conversion of this creating shared value model. Culture is critical. The frenetic pace inside of Equifax right now does not lend itself to too many people coming on board with what I'm selling here right now. If you're a salesperson and you're tasked with driving revenue in a brand that's a little bit, it's a interesting brand out there in the society right now, it's difficult. The cultural change for me was the recognition that I needed to stop talking about this in passionate community terms inside of the company and start talking about what it means for the bottom line. And it took me a while. It's not my nature, but I knew that if these people were going to come along, these people being the C-suite individuals who make the decisions for this company, as well as the board, that they had to see that there was something more than just a PR or a brand stamp on some sort of charitable event. So it was long in coming. And it was my own education as well. I've actually pretty much received a third degree from WashU between the business school and the Brown School of Social Work where I teach. You know, I don't naturally come by this. But what I saw was that we weren't doing anything. We weren't changing lives. We weren't. So the cultural piece is something that I'm always deeply attuned to. And I think the quote from the young woman from Georgia Tech is what I think about. Because, you know, by and large, and I know it's overused, but millennials and younger generations, they are coming into employment demanding that the company thinks very smartly about this. And if they don't get it, they leave. And when they come in, often it's their second job, they're 24, 25. They've brought with them examples of how it can work better than what we're doing. So CSV is useful right now. The cultural shift, it's got to shift almost every day for it to sustain. That's a great question. I think about it all the time. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me today.